It began on a quiet Tuesday morning just outside the city of Rome. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the cobblestones, when Pope Francis stepped out of a modest car near a rural convent for an unannounced visit. As always, he preferred these quiet moments, unfiltered by ceremony or media, just him and the people. But that morning, someone else was waiting. From beneath a crumbling stone wall padded out a small, weathered dog. His fur was patchy, his ribs faintly visible beneath the surface, and his tail wagged with a mixture of hope and hesitation. He didn't bark or run, he simply walked slowly, as though he were certain of who he was approaching. The clergy and aides surrounding the Pope shifted, unsure. One of the security officers stepped forward, but Francis gently raised a hand. "Let him come," he said softly. The dog sat just a few feet away, his dark eyes locked onto the Pope's. There was no fear in them, just something quiet and familiar, like the gaze of someone who had seen both suffering and grace. Pope Francis bent down without a word and extended his hand. The dog stepped forward and gently pressed his head into the Pope's palm. The moment lingered, so simple and yet so powerful that even the aides were struck silent. He was no ordinary stray. "I think he's been waiting for someone," the Pope said after a long pause. "Or maybe he's been following someone we cannot see." That afternoon, the dog climbed into the back of the Pope's car without being called. No leash, no hesitation. He simply knew. The Pope named him Benedetto, meaning blessed, a quiet tribute to a former friend and to the gentle nature of this unexpected companion. Back at the Vatican, there was surprise at the sight of the small dog walking through the great bronze doors beside the Holy Father. Some staff were skeptical at first, unsure how a stray fit into such sacred halls. But Francis only smiled and said, "Even the smallest creature can carry the spirit of something greater." Benedetto settled in with quiet ease, curling at the foot of the Pope's chair, never begging, never barking. It was as if he had always belonged there. That was the beginning of a friendship the world would come to know, not just between a pope and a dog, but between two souls who had found each other in the most unexpected place. Life inside the Vatican is built on quiet routines and sacred discipline. Each hallway echoes with history. Each chamber carries the weight of centuries. Yet amid this grand setting, a new and humble presence began to draw attention, not with noise or disruption, but through stillness. Benedetto quickly adapted to his new life beside Pope Francis. He didn't explore recklessly or seek attention like most dogs might. Instead, he followed the Pope quietly, matching his steps with gentle precision. Wherever Francis went, the little dog was never far behind. Each morning, before the city awoke, the Pope would walk through the Vatican gardens to pray and reflect. Now there were two sets of footprints along the dew-covered paths, one from a shepherd of faith and the other from a loyal soul who needed no words to understand him. Guards and gardeners began to notice the dog's almost sacred calm. He would sit patiently outside closed doors during meetings, never whining or scratching. When the Pope returned, Benedetto would rise, stretch, and fall into step beside him like a shadow. "He doesn't need commands," one aide remarked. "It's as if he already knows where to go." Pope Francis often smiled when others spoke of the dog's unusual behavior. "He listens better than most people," he would joke, but privately he felt something deeper. In Benedetto's quiet presence, he found comfort, a constant companion in a life filled with constant expectation. At night, when the halls fell silent, the Pope would retire to his quarters with Benedetto curled at the foot of the bed. On especially long days, the dog would rest his head gently on the Pope's slippered feet, as if to say, "You are not alone." Word of the dog began to spread through the Vatican. Priests, cardinals, even visiting bishops would pause when they passed him, nodding in respect. Children visiting with their families would crouch down to pet him, giggling when he gave soft licks or simply rested beside them. But Benedetto never wandered far. His eyes always watched the Pope. His ears would perk up at the sound of his voice, even from another room. He was more than a pet. He was a quiet witness to the Pope's days, a silent keeper of his burdens, and a presence that asked for nothing except to remain close. As months turned into years, their bond deepened, not through grand gestures, but through 1,000 simple moments of trust and peace. As seasons passed over the Vatican, so too did the weight of global events. The world watched Pope Francis for guidance through difficult times, moments of conflict, unrest, and sorrow. His voice brought hope to many, but behind the scenes, it was often Benedetto who gave hope to him. No matter how heavy the burden of leadership became, the little dog remained at the Pope's side. Whether it was a long day of audiences, international visits, or meetings with troubled leaders, Benedetto waited patiently. He never barked, never begged, just waited, as if he knew that when the Pope returned, he might need the kind of comfort only silence could bring. When winter came and the Vatican's ancient stone corridors grew cold, Benedetto became a source of warmth, not just physically, but emotionally. On one particularly stormy December evening, Pope Francis returned from a tense meeting with world ambassadors. He looked tired and defeated. As he sat down to remove his heavy robes, Benedetto walked over, laid his head gently on the Pope's knee, and let out a soft sigh. Francis smiled for the first time all day. "He doesn't need words to speak to me," he told a visiting bishop later that night. "He teaches with his presence." Soon, it wasn't only Vatican staff who noticed. Photos of the dog began to appear in the background of official papal events. In one widely shared image, Benedetto sat peacefully beneath the Pope's chair during a televised address. The camera hadn't meant to catch him, but his calm expression, ears relaxed, eyes closed, somehow stole the scene. People around the world began to ask about the Pope's dog. Who was he? Where did he come from? Was he trained? The Vatican gave no formal answers. Pope Francis simply said, "He came when I needed him." Children from across the globe sent drawings and letters. One child wrote, "I want to be like your dog, kind and quiet and always there." The Pope kept the note on his desk. Even visiting leaders, hardened by politics, would often pause to greet Benedetto. Some knelt. Some simply patted his head and moved on. But every one of them, in that brief moment, felt the stillness the dog carried. To Francis, Benedetto was not just a companion. He was a reflection of the humility he tried to live by, soft-spoken, present, and full of love. In the quiet between prayers and politics, it was this little dog who reminded him of the peace he preached. Time, even in the stillness of the Vatican, does not slow for anyone, not even for a man loved by millions. As Pope Francis aged, his movements grew slower, his voice softer, and his days a bit shorter. Yet through it all, Benedetto remained close, never leaving his side. In the early mornings, the Pope no longer walked the full length of the garden paths. He now sat in his favorite stone bench beneath a cluster of olive trees. Benedetto would curl up beside his feet, eyes half closed, ears twitching only when the wind stirred the branches above them. Francis had stopped attending large public masses and began holding smaller services with close staff and longtime friends. It was during these quiet gatherings that many began to notice just how deeply the Pope relied on his faithful companion. Even when words fail him, one aide whispered, "He still speaks to the dog." In the evenings, the Pope would rest longer, sometimes drifting off in his chair before reaching his quarters. Benedetto never left the room. He would simply lie near, lifting his head when nurses came in, as if reminding them to be gentle. As the Pope's health declined, doctors advised full-time medical care. A private room was prepared, lined with the soft glow of lamps and the sound of quiet hymns. Benedetto was allowed to stay, lying silently on a cushioned mat placed beside the Pope's bed. He never barked. He never whimpered. He just watched, blinking slowly, guarding his friend in the only way he knew how. On his final day, the Pope awoke just once. With great effort, he turned his head toward Benedetto. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out. The dog rose and placed his head gently beneath the Pope's hand, letting him rest there. It was a gesture so simple, yet so filled with meaning that those present felt the weight of it. Pope Francis passed away quietly that evening, surrounded by prayer, love, and the steady heartbeat of his loyal companion lying inches from his side. When the moment came, Benedetto let out a single, low whimper, not loud, not sharp, but long and deep, like a sigh from the soul. Then he lowered his head to the floor and closed his eyes. He did not leave the room that night, nor the next. He waited, as if expecting his friend to return from one more quiet walk in the garden. The funeral of Pope Francis drew people from every corner of the world. Dignitaries, clergy, and ordinary citizens filled the Vatican with prayers, memories, and quiet tears. His casket was carried through St. Peter's Square beneath a heavy gray sky. The air felt still, as if the city itself held its breath. But through all the grandeur, eyes kept drifting to the smallest figure among the mourners, Benedetto. He had followed the procession from the Pope's private quarters to the garden where his body would rest. No leash held him. No one told him what to do. Yet he walked with purpose, every step slow and steady, as if he knew this goodbye was unlike any other. When the final prayers were said and the crowds began to thin, Benedetto did not move. As workers began to gently place earth over the grave, the dog sat perfectly still, watching. Only when the last handful of soil was settled and the people began to leave did he finally act. He stepped forward, lay down beside the freshly packed earth, and placed his head against the grave. No one had the heart to move him. At first, Vatican staff assumed he would eventually return to his usual spot in the Pope's residence. They brought food and water, softly calling his name. But Benedetto didn't respond. He ate only when hunger forced him, then returned to the grave as if drawn by an invisible thread. Days passed. Rain came and soaked the stone. The sun followed, warming the earth again. Still, Benedetto remained. Tourists whispered, unsure whether to approach. Some cried quietly behind the low garden walls. Photographers captured the image of a small dog curled beside the grave of one of the most beloved spiritual leaders in recent memory. It was shared across continents, an image too pure to explain, too powerful to forget. The Vatican provided a small canopy for him, just enough to shield him from the worst weather. Guards checked on him through the night. Priests stopped by with whispered blessings, but no one dared move him. It became clear that Benedetto was not simply grieving. He was keeping vigil. Not out of obligation, not because someone had trained him to do it, but because his heart remained tied to the one soul he had chosen above all others. No one told him to stay. And yet, he did. As if love itself had taught him to wait. It began with a single photo. A visitor to the Vatican garden had captured it from behind the wrought iron fence. Benedetto curled tightly against the side of Pope Francis' grave, his eyes closed, his small body still. The image was shared on social media with a simple caption, "Loyal until the end." By morning, it had reached millions. News outlets across the globe ran the story. Headlines called him the mourning dog, the Pope's final guardian, and the silent sermon. Journalists scrambled for details about Benedetto's life, but the Vatican offered only a short statement. He was the Pope's companion. Now he stays by his side. The simplicity of it only made the story more powerful. People were moved not by tragedy, but by the purity of the dog's love. Letters flooded the Vatican. Some were from world leaders, others from school children. Drawings arrived showing a little brown dog beside a figure in white robes, both surrounded by light. Some sent poems, others prayers, all saying the same thing. We see him, we understand. In a world often divided, Benedetto had become a quiet symbol of unity. His grief transcended language. His loyalty needed no explanation. For many, it was as if the Pope had left behind one last message, and it had come through the silence of a faithful animal. Pilgrims visiting the Vatican began asking to see the dog. Some waited near the garden gates just to catch a glimpse. When they saw him there, unmoving, heads would lower, hands would clasp in prayer. It was no longer just a dog beside a grave. It had become something sacred. The Vatican staff, moved by the public's response, placed a small sign near the garden wall. It read, "Please do not disturb Benedetto. He is where he chooses to be." Benedetto remained unaware of the global attention. He didn't know his photo had been shared in churches, classrooms, and homes around the world. He didn't know that millions spoke his name in reverence. All he knew was that his friend was gone, and this was where he had last felt him. In that still garden corner, beneath the olive trees, the world's most unassuming messenger lay in peaceful defiance of time. He had become a story without words, a sermon without voice, a heart that remained open long after its match had gone. And in doing so, he reminded the world what it means to truly love. Weeks turned into months, and still Benedetto remained. Each morning, the sun rose over the Vatican gardens, spilling golden light across the olive trees and the quiet stone where Pope Francis lay. And there, in the same familiar place, the little dog kept his post, head resting gently against the grave. Though he never sought attention, the world continued to give it. Visitors left flowers by the garden fence. Children placed drawings between the bars. One boy from Argentina had sketched the Pope holding hands with a smiling dog, both standing on a cloud. At the bottom, he had written in careful handwriting, "Together again someday." Vatican staff began to rotate caretakers to ensure Benedetto's well-being. A gentle nun named Sister Amelia took a special interest in him. She would bring soft blankets when the nights turned cool and whisper prayers beside him, though Benedetto rarely lifted his head. He accepted her presence but looked beyond her, always toward the stone that marked his friend's rest. The cardinals, initially unsure about what role the dog played in this sacred place, had come to speak of him with quiet respect. One remarked, "He reminds us what unwavering faith looks like, not in doctrine, but in devotion." When spring arrived, the Vatican held a special outdoor service to commemorate the first year since Pope Francis's passing. Thousands gathered in the square, while the Pope's closest aides stood near the garden where he had been laid to rest. Benedetto was there, of course. He did not join the crowd. He did not react to the chorus or the bells. But as the final hymn echoed through the trees, something remarkable happened. He stood. Slowly, carefully, Benedetto rose to his feet. He turned toward the gathering, walked forward just a few paces, and sat, tall and still, facing the people as if acknowledging them. A soft gasp moved through the crowd. It was as if, just for a moment, he had taken the Pope's place, not as a leader, but as a quiet symbol of his love, his humility, and his faith. The crowd began to clap, not in celebration, but in reverence. Some wept. Some simply bowed their heads. And Benedetto, calm as ever, turned back to the grave and lay down once more. He had spoken no words. But in that moment, the people felt they had received one last blessing through him. The seasons continued their quiet cycle through the Vatican gardens. Leaves turned golden, then fell. Rain came and washed the paths clean. Yet one thing remained unchanged. Benedetto, ever faithful, still lay beside the grave of the man he had never left. He had grown slower now. The spring in his step had faded, and his eyes, once alert and watchful, had grown clouded with age. Still, no one could coax him away for long. He would accept gentle food, warm blankets, and the soft touch of kind hands, but always he returned to the same sacred place. His body had grown weary, but his heart remained rooted. One cold morning in late autumn, Sister Amelia found him lying especially still. The garden was hushed, a gray mist floating low over the earth. She approached quietly, as she always did, and knelt beside him. Benedetto did not stir. There was no pain in his expression, no struggle in his breath. He had simply fallen asleep with his head resting against the stone that marked Pope Francis's final resting place, his final vigil complete. Word spread quickly, and with it came a wave of silence. The kind that happens when the world recognizes something deeply sacred has ended. The Vatican held a private ceremony for him. There were no trumpets, no great procession, just a small gathering of those who had seen the beauty in his silent loyalty. They placed him gently in a small casket lined with white linen, and at the request of the Pope's former aides, buried him just beside the grave of the man he had loved. 2 stones now stood beneath the olive trees. One bore the name of a spiritual leader whom had touched millions. The other, smaller and simpler, carried a single word, Benedetto. Visitors still came. They brought flowers for both graves. Some prayed. Some sat quietly on the nearby benches and simply watched the light filter through the branches, listening to the breeze move through the leaves. In time, the story of the little dog who refused to leave his friend's side became legend, not as folklore, but as something deeply true, passed on in whispers, in sermons, in books and hearts alike. And though both souls had left this world, their bond remained, etched in stone, carried by memory, and living proof that love, in its truest form, does not end. It waits, it watches, and when the time comes, it follows.